They thought it was just another joke, just another day of messing with people. But today, they picked the wrong one. A group of young guys, bored and looking for trouble, gathered around the corner. The air was thick with laughter, the kind that only comes from being completely at ease with the chaos they were about to stir up. One guy kicked a can across the sidewalk, watching it bounce and rattle. Another was leaning against the street lamp, tapping his foot to the rhythm of music blasting from a distant speaker. "Someone's got to walk by soon," one of them muttered, glancing down the street. "And when they do, we'll have some fun." And sure enough, a figure appeared in the distance, a woman, her boots clicking firmly on the pavement. She walked with purpose, her posture straight and her uniform crisp. There was no flashy patrol car or siren blaring, just a cop, walking like she owned the street. To them, she was just another person to mess with. They didn't care about her, her uniform, or her job. All they saw was a target, someone who had no idea what was about to happen. As she got closer, the guys started to move. One grabbed a bottle of water, another found a half-empty soda can. Their eyes glinted with mischief. They were ready. She had no idea the storm that was coming her way. The group sprang into action as soon as they saw her approach. They didn't have a plan. They didn't need one. This was supposed to be fun, just like any other time they picked a random person to mess with. But today, they were a little more hyped up than usual. One of them, Jared, the loudest of the bunch, grabbed an old plastic bottle of water. He shook it vigorously, watching the pressure build up, imagining how perfect the splash would be. He handed it off to Jason, who passed him a half-drunk soda can. The soda fizzed and sloshed inside, like it was just waiting for its moment of glory. "Yo, you think she'll notice?" Jared asked, eyes wide with excitement. "Don't matter," Jason replied with a grin. "We just throw it. She's gonna be soaked either way." They laughed, the sound echoing in the street like a pack of hyenas ready to pounce. One of them, Kyle, a bit more methodical, looked down at the ground. He bent down and scooped up a handful of dirt. "Oh, this'll make it even better." He held it up, watching the dust fall between his fingers before casually tossing it to his buddy. "Dirt. It'll stick to her too. Let's see her get that out of her uniform." They didn't know what they were doing. They were just kids, caught up in their own joke, thinking it was harmless. After all, this wasn't the first time they'd humiliated someone like this. A quick laugh, a moment of satisfaction, and then it was over. The woman was getting closer now, unaware of what was about to happen. Her boots clicked against the pavement, steady and confident. She didn't even glance their way. "Now," Jared said, his voice hushed, filled with anticipation. And then it happened. Splash! The cold water hit her like a slap to the face, drenching her from head to toe. The bottle burst open with such force that it sent a wave over her, soaking her uniform and running down the front of her pants. Before she could even process it, the soda came next. Boom! It exploded, sticky liquid splattering everywhere, covering her arms and chest in a sugary mess. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She didn't even stop walking. Her uniform, once crisp and neat, was now drenched and stained. But she didn't look down, didn't even seem to care. The guys stood there, watching her, waiting for some kind of reaction. And oof, dirt flew through the air, landing in her hair, splattering on her shoulders, and sticking to the wet fabric of her uniform like a cruel icing on the cake. The guys burst into laughter. It was loud, full of mocking, and not a single ounce of remorse. They pointed at her, their faces red with amusement. They laughed so hard, one of them almost fell over. "Ha! Look at her now!" Kyle howled. "She's a mess. This is too easy." Jared slapped his knee, eyes wide with excitement. "Man, she looks like a walking trash can." Jason pulled out his phone, already recording. "This is going straight to social media. Gonna be viral in no time." They couldn't stop laughing, watching her stumble forward, soaking wet, her hair covered in dirt. To them, it was the funniest thing they'd seen all day. She was just another target, someone they could mess with and laugh about later. But then, something strange happened. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She didn't even react. She kept walking, her steps as steady as before. There wasn't a hint of anger in her face, not even a furrowed brow. She didn't say a word. Nothing. Her silence was unnerving. The guys stood frozen, the laughter dying in their throats as they watched her walk away, each of them suddenly feeling a little more unsure of themselves. It wasn't the reaction they expected. They thought she'd shout, cry, or maybe even fight back. But she didn't do any of that. She just walked away, her boots clicking on the pavement as if nothing had happened. "What the hell?" Jason said, lowering his phone. "She didn't even say anything," Kyle added, his voice laced with confusion. Jared, still holding the water bottle, looked at the others. Did we mess up? But none of them could answer. They had done what they thought was harmless fun, but somehow it felt wrong now. Something about her silence, her complete lack of reaction, made them question whether they had gone too far. But before they could dwell on it too long, they heard the distant sound of sirens, and that was when they realized they had messed up big time. By the time she reached the station, she was drenched. Water dripped from her uniform in streams, the soda was sticky and clinging to her like a second skin, and the dirt, now caked into her hair and shoulders, made her look like she'd just crawled out of a mud pit. She was a far cry from the polished, composed woman who had walked into the neighborhood just a short time ago. Her boots made a squelching sound with every step as she entered the station, but her expression was unreadable. No anger, no frustration. Just a steady, unwavering calm that was almost unsettling. The moment she walked through the doors, her colleagues, some of whom had only just met her, stared. A few of them stopped mid-conversation, eyes wide, unsure of what they were seeing. The buzz of voices dropped into an awkward silence. It wasn't just her soaked and dirty appearance that caught their attention. It was the sheer presence she carried, even in such an unorthodox state. One of the officers, a young guy named Mike, was the first to speak up. "Chief, what happened to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, clearly unsure if this was a prank or something more serious. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as she surveyed the station. The looks on their faces, the questions hanging in the air, didn't faze her. She wiped some of the dirt from her cheek, still maintaining that eerie composure, and then spoke, her voice low but firm. "I was just humiliated in public," she said simply. "But don't worry, I've got it handled." Her words hung in the air, leaving the officers confused, exchanging glances, and wondering what exactly she meant. She walked into her office without another word, not waiting for a follow-up question. But soon, her silence was broken. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, her finger tapping over the screen with a cold, decisive purpose. She wasn't about to let what had happened slide. The message was clear. She wasn't just a cop. She was the new police chief, and this was her town now. Without another moment's hesitation, she hit the dial, sending out the call. 15 minutes later, the front of the station was a whirlwind of activity. Sirens screamed into the air, echoing down the streets. A convoy of 15 police cars, each one brimming with officers, pulled into the station's lot. The vehicles were ready for action, engines roaring, lights flashing, their presence an unmistakable show of force. Officers poured out of the cars, some still adjusting their gear, others rushing to form ranks, their expressions hardening as they received orders. They weren't sure what was happening, but when the chief gave a command, it was never taken lightly. She stood at the front of the group, now changed into a fresh uniform, still cool and composed as if this was just another day on the job. She surveyed the scene for a moment before speaking. "Gather the team. We're going on a little trip." Her voice was cold, no trace of the soaked, humiliated woman they had just seen walking in. Her colleagues scrambled into formation, and within minutes, the convoy was rolling out, engines thundering down the street, the sirens cutting through the air like a storm approaching. The officers didn't know where they were headed yet, but the weight of what was about to happen was already setting in. They drove for about 15 minutes, cutting through the neighborhood where she had been humiliated. The convoy slowed down as they approached the block where the incident had happened. There, in the distance, the group of guys they were looking for stood near the same graffiti-covered wall, still laughing and talking as if nothing had happened. They didn't even notice the approaching line of police cars until the engines roared louder and the lights flashed brighter. And then, it hit them, reality crashing into their egos like a ton of bricks. The cars screeched to a halt, and before they could even move, the doors flew open, and police officers poured out like a flood. The guys were surrounded within seconds, caught in the most embarrassing trap they could ever imagine. Well, one of the officers said with a smirk. Looks like we've got a little situation here. The guys froze, their laughter fading into nervous stares as they realized who had been the target of their so-called joke. And at the center of it all, standing tall, was the woman they had humiliated, now wearing the badge of authority. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The guys would soon learn just how bad of a mistake they'd made. The flashing lights of the convoy illuminated the streets, cutting through the dusk like a warning shot. The neighborhood, once calm and unsuspecting, froze in an instant. Windows slid shut, doors locked, and people ducked behind their curtains. Whispers filled the air as the sirens blared through the narrow streets, echoing off the walls like a thunderstorm approaching. But it wasn't a storm that had come. It was a reckoning. The group of guys, still grinning in the same reckless, arrogant way, were the last to notice. They stood in the same spot, beneath the graffiti-covered wall, unaware of the chaos about to unfold. As the line of police vehicles neared, their laughter began to die down, replaced by a growing sense of unease. When the cars came to a screeching halt, it was like the calm before the storm. Sirens wailed. The police poured out of the vehicles in full force, a sea of blue uniforms quickly flooding the block. They didn't just walk, they moved with purpose, like they owned the streets. One by one, the group of guys was surrounded, their attempts to escape smothered by the sheer numbers of officers encircling them. No one spoke. No one laughed. Their bravado evaporated in the face of the approaching storm. "Hands where I can see them," one officer barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Move it!" Panic rippled through the group. The sight of 15 fully equipped police officers was enough to send their thoughts scrambling. They had no idea what was happening or why. All they knew was that this wasn't the usual police response. This was something different, something bigger. They were arrested without a word of protest, their attempts to talk their way out of it quickly drowned by the officers' firm commands. The tight grip of handcuffs slapped over their wrists felt cold, their defiance shattering under the weight of their impending consequences. No longer were they the ones with the upper hand. They were nothing more than suspects in a game they'd unwittingly lost. The journey to the station was a quiet one. The police cars sped through the streets, lights flashing and sirens blaring, while the guys sat in the back of the squad cars, tense and silent. Some were muttering under their breath, others stared straight ahead, not daring to look at the officers surrounding them. They didn't know where they were headed, but they had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to be good. When the cars finally pulled into the station, they were escorted inside in a grim procession. Each of the young men was led through the doors one by one, and it was only then that the true weight of what had happened began to settle in. Their eyes widened when they saw her, the woman they had humiliated, standing at the front of the room, her posture tall and commanding. Her uniform was spotless now, the dirt and water long gone, replaced by the authority that had always been there but hidden beneath the surface. The silence in the room was deafening. The guys shuffled nervously, avoiding her gaze. They hadn't seen her up close before, hadn't realized who they'd picked for their cruel joke. But now, standing before her in the very place they thought they were safe, they knew. They were facing the new police chief, the woman they had publicly drenched, dirtied, and humiliated. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made even the bravest of the group shrink back. None of them answered. They stood there, eyes fixed on the ground, unable to meet her gaze. "Tell me why I should let you off with a warning," she continued, her voice icy now. "You decided it was fun to make me a target. That you humiliated me in front of my community, in front of my town. What do you have to say for yourselves?" Their lips trembled, but none of them could find the words. A few of them shifted, discomfort spreading across their faces. After all, the woman they had mocked was now their judge and jury, and their bravado was gone. They couldn't even look her in the eyes. "Apologize," one officer snapped from the side. "Apologize to the chief, now." They shuffled awkwardly, each one of them taking turns to murmur half-hearted apologies, but it wasn't enough. The apologies were forced, hollow. They lacked sincerity, the words falling out like an afterthought. The chief didn't flinch. She wasn't buying it. Her expression never wavered as she turned to the officers standing in line behind her. "Take them outside," she ordered, her voice unwavering. "Make sure they understand what happens when you cross the line. You don't just disrespect anyone in this town. You respect everyone." The officers nodded, swiftly taking action. Within moments, the group of guys was marched outside, where a new punishment awaited them, one that would leave a lasting mark on their pride. "Clean up this neighborhood," the chief called out, her voice echoing across the parking lot. "Clean up the mess you made." The guys' eyes widened, their protests filling the air, but the officers weren't listening. They were given rakes, shovels, and trash bags, tools to clean up the mess they had started. They were told to pick up every last piece of trash, scrub every wall, and make the neighborhood look as spotless as it had before. And they weren't just cleaning up trash. They were cleaning up the mess they had made with their arrogance, their disrespect, and their cruelty. For 10 straight days, they worked. They cleaned the streets, the walls, and the yards. They scrubbed the pavement, removing any trace of their earlier actions. Each day, they grew more tired, more humbled, as the reality of their punishment set in. By the time the 10 days were up, the entire neighborhood was spotless. The guys stood before the chief again, eyes downcast, tired and broken, knowing that the punishment hadn't just been physical, it had been a lesson. "You've learned," the chief said, her voice firm but fair. "Now, you'll sign an undertaking, promising never to disrespect anyone in this community again. If you break that promise, you'll face worse than this." The guys signed, each one of them humbled, their once cocky attitudes now stripped away. They had crossed the line. And now, they had paid the ultimate price. The group of young men stood outside the station, looking at each other in disbelief. They had expected the worst: jail time, fines, maybe even worse. But instead, they were met with something far more humiliating than they could have imagined. A creative punishment designed not just to make them work, but to truly make them feel the sting of their actions. The new police chief, still standing tall and composed, stepped forward with a smirk that hinted she had something special in mind. "You think you can just pour water and dirt on me, then walk away with no consequences?" She raised an eyebrow, letting the words sink in. "Well, guess what? I'm not putting you in a cell, and I'm not handing you a fine. You're going to clean up this entire neighborhood for the next 10 days. The guys exchanged uneasy glances. 10 days? They weren't sure if they'd survive the boredom, let alone the humiliation that was about to follow. "But that's not all," she continued, her tone cold and authoritative. "You're going to personally apologize to every single person you disrespected. Every single one. I want you to go to their homes, knock on their doors, and tell them you're sorry for your actions. And if you think about being lazy, there's always another round of cleaning waiting for you." The air was thick with their discomfort. The neighborhood, the very one they thought they'd gotten away with tormenting, was about to be their battleground. They didn't know what was worse: the thought of spending 10 days picking up trash and dirt, or the personal humiliation they'd have to endure, standing at the doorstep of every person they'd wronged. The chief's voice broke through their thoughts. "And to make sure you never forget this lesson, you'll also sign an undertaking. A contract, if you will, promising that you'll never cause trouble again. If you do, we'll make sure the consequences are much worse." One by one, the guys signed the documents, their heads hanging in shame as they realized that they had no choice. The chief's creativity had turned their actions into a spectacle they could never escape. The reality of their situation was settling in. But what they didn't know was that this would be the moment they'd become the laughingstock of the entire community. As soon as the guys started their work, it wasn't long before the residents began to notice. From their front porches, people peered out, catching the unexpected spectacle. Phones were whipped out, and before they knew it, the group of guys was the subject of viral videos across social media. One video popped up, showing them pushing wheelbarrows filled with trash, their backs hunched in the hot sun, their faces scrunched in frustration. The person filming zoomed in on one of the guys, who was trying to avoid eye contact with the camera as he picked up an empty soda can. "Look at this," a voice laughed off camera. "They really thought they were tough." The video quickly racked up thousands of views. It didn't stop there. Every few minutes, someone else posted a new clip, one of the guys sweeping a sidewalk, another apologizing awkwardly to an elderly woman who clearly wasn't having it. The community was having a blast. Comments poured in. "Lol, bet they regret that prank now. Can't believe this is real. They were just laughing like idiots before." Plot twist. The new chief is out here turning them into community service officers. The mocking didn't end with online posts. Every time one of the guys approached a house to apologize, neighbors gathered to watch, some even coming outside to offer their own sarcastic remarks. "Hey, don't forget to clean my driveway too," one man called out. "You owe me one for that spilled soda." Another person shouted, "Better get that sidewalk spotless. You've got a reputation to rebuild." They were humiliated at every turn. The residents, the ones they'd once taunted and disrespected, were now watching their every move, eagerly recording their struggle. Even the kids in the neighborhood got in on the fun. A group of teenagers stood in front of one house, laughing and pointing as one of the guys, his face beet red, tried to apologize to a woman whose car they had drenched with water. "What's that, big guy? Sorry? You think we'll believe it?" one of the teens jeered. Another added, "Yeah, good luck with that, bro." The guy's pride was shattered. They weren't just cleaning up trash. They were cleaning up their own image, piece by painful piece. The more they tried to apologize, the more their efforts seemed to fall short. The eyes of the entire neighborhood were upon them, and every apology felt hollow, every action another reminder of how foolish they'd been. By the time they reached the final day of their punishment, they had cleaned every inch of the neighborhood. The sidewalks sparkled, the streets were spotless, and every single resident had heard their half-hearted apologies. They'd gotten the job done, but it hadn't been easy. Their backs ached, their pride was gone, and they'd learned the hardest lesson of all. Karma had a way of coming back, and when it did, it was a whole lot more creative than they ever expected. As they signed their final undertaking, they knew it was over. The chief had gotten her payback, and the neighborhood had gotten the last laugh. They'd learned their lesson, but not without the kind of embarrassment that would haunt them forever. The last day of their punishment arrived, and the boys were beyond exhausted. Their hands were sore from scrubbing, their shoulders stiff from carrying bags of trash, and their faces were barely recognizable from the embarrassment they'd endured. They had scrubbed every inch of the neighborhood, picked up every discarded bottle, and offered apologies to every resident who had witnessed their cruel prank. They were tired, physically and emotionally, but there was no escaping the truth. They had learned their lesson. As the sun began to set, casting a soft glow over the freshly cleaned streets, they spotted her again, the police chief. She was walking down the same street, the same confidence in her stride, but this time, something was different. The boys who had once mocked and humiliated her now stood still. They couldn't bring themselves to look her in the eye. They didn't say a word, didn't joke around. No more smirks, no more laughter. She nodded at them as she walked by. The boys simply nodded back, too afraid to even glance her way for fear of making a mistake. They had learned respect the hard way, and this time, they knew better than to take their actions lightly. Their foolishness had led to consequences, and it was clear. Respect wasn't something that came easy, but it was something that was earned. Especially through humility, karma always finds its way back. The disrespect you show others will eventually circle back around, and it won't always be as nice as you expect. Respect isn't a joke, and there are always consequences for thoughtless actions. It's not about what you get away with, it's about how you carry yourself and treat others. So what do you think? Did they deserve it? Let me know in the comments. And if you loved this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more crazy stories.